Hello, everyone. We are happy to be back with a new episode of the CyberPeace podcast. In this episode, we have the honor of hosting Mr. Pooran Pandey. Pooran Pandey is a member of the UNESCO Policy Lab in Paris, a steering committee member of the UNICEF on water and sanitation, and alumnus of the London School of Economics and Cambridge University, and also a former member of the board in the World Food Programme. Hope you're doing well, sir.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Wanda. And thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you so much, sir. So, our conversation today will majorly focus on India's bilateral ties with the African continent. Talking about the ties between India and Africa, as one knows, India and Africa share a diverse relationship characterized by historical ties, economic collaboration, and also cultural exchanges. So, over the years, both regions have engaged in various initiatives aimed at enhancing trade and investment and development cooperation. India's growing presence in Africa is evident through its investments in sectors such as technology, agriculture, and infrastructure, which aims to foster sustainable growth. Additionally, cultural connections, including education and people to people interactions, further strengthen the bond between India and African nations, paving the way for a mutually beneficial partnership in the global arena. So, with this, sir, let's start off. So, in terms of in the India-Africa bilateral cooperation, how has the recent global geopolitical shifts influenced the nature and priorities of both?
Thank you so much indeed. And this is a very important side
Right.
to India and Africa
Yes.
relations. If you really put yourself in contemporary context,
Hmm.
you'll figure out that Europe is now in a different kind of a pathway. On their very doorstep, you have Ukraine and Russia blabbering, and which has gone on for a longer time than what many of us might have intended. And let's look at Asia. Asia is also not very subtle because you have China's presence and then your presence of other forces like Japan, South Korea, India. So there is, I won't say this war, but there is a moving frame where we keep on running into each other. So Europe and Asia are now, finding things going a little difficult. But Africa, if we were to look at and look at India-Africa relations, they are number one, very old. If you travel to Africa, you will figure out that everyone in Africa looks at India as a friend, as a brother, and they're very respectful of what India has done for Africa over a period of time. Now, having said, it is not only bilateral any longer in terms of what we have with Africa, it is multilateral, and then above all, it is also trilateral. If I can give you one example, trilateral partnership between India and Africa has been doing so well. And let's look at Cameroon, where Germany and India have come together both with the expertise, skill, and money, and they have taken up a very large project of educating Cameroonian young people, which is not only traditional subjects, but these subjects are basically science, technology, skill development, and trying to see as to how can India and Germany, with their money and skill and competence, can go to a country in West Africa called Cameroon and try and undertake, or at least, better to say, an educational transformation in Cameroon, which is now playing out so well. So it's no longer between you and me. It's no longer between a couple of countries in Africa. It is all about a couple of countries coming together, identifying an issue in Africa, and then putting money, resources, and talent pool to go and try and figure out how can India and some other countries which are friends of India can go to African countries and do things in science, tech, trade, education. So the list is endless, but what I can say is it's happening at a very fast pace. The scale is pretty big. And while the scale is pretty big, you can go and see the kind of transformation with trilateral partnership of India with Africa is working also well.
So, with regard to digital transformation and economy, what are the new opportunities and challenges in this area present for strengthening India and Africa ties?
Look, and Africa is a continent which is a consortium of 54 countries. They are culturally very rich. Family values are pretty high. And then African people are roughly about 1.5 billion people. So what is really happening in Africa is that Africans are now pinned on hope. There's the only thing which can solve both the problems today and tomorrow is going to be only through education. And education in Africa means science, tech, digital transformation, cyber peace, cyber security. And then the African diaspora, for instance, in case of US, is so powerful that they are trying to leave the country, go out, learn a skill, come back, and then try and unleash the innovation part in Africa. And this is happening across the board. It's happening in education, it's happening in trade and technology, it's happening in banking. In Africa, when I travel and go and see people there, a very large amount of money is being transferred online, and there's no problem. So Africa's transformation, it is known by now, both by Africans and also by countries like India, that their transformation will hinge on two facts. One, how much more can they be educated? And secondly, how much more exposure can they be given to digital transformation? So this is a part one. Part two is Africa being Africa has several challenges. The first challenge for Africa is they are basically an agrarian society. They have a very large swath of land, but only 10% of that land is being cultivated. And with climate change occurring in Africa, water levels are going down. CO2 emissions are pretty hard. And therefore, it is double whammy, where the yield is coming down on one hand, and secondly, livelihood of African farmers is also not very good. So I think when we think about digital transformation and green growth, Africa is the only continent at the top which can unleash the power of plenty if we can put things in order. So I think Africa is a continent of tomorrow. All that they need to do is to come together. 54 countries will need to be one. The currency, which is 32 minimum, will need to be one. Because in Africa, if you travel from one country to a couple of more, and so $100 in a pocket, by the time in the evening you reach a third or fourth country, the value of $100 is gone down to zero. So they need to take some proactive steps to be able to sort out certain areas and issues whereby they can become one Africa. I think there's a pathway for Africa, but Africa is the continent of tomorrow. They will put a lot of efforts, which they have been doing, to cultivate more land, grow more food, become a food basket, not only for African continent, but also for Europe. So this is the Africa of tomorrow, but there are challenges which they will have to overcome and find a pathway to keep on moving and see how can they put their difficulties and problems in a way that they become very, very what's called forward, looking and forward.
So, in what specific sectors can India and African nations enhance their cooperation to address like shared development challenges in the post-pandemic era?
Well, pandemic has been pretty hard for everyone. It was very hard for Africa
In fact, for
because
the whole world.
yeah, I mean this was pretty
Yeah.
bad. And in wake of COVID, African continent realized the following. They thought when the COVID came, there was large scale inequity in the health sector. And you might have heard and seen as well that they did not get, the sort of ways they would have otherwise got in order to get rid of COVID. So large scale inequity in Africa has been the one part which has really hit them pretty hard when the COVID happened. Second thing was that when COVID came, the trade suffered heavily, which it still keeps on raising its fang on underdevelopment of Africa in a way. Third thing is where COVID came and hit them hard was education. I mean, they were not so privileged like we are, where they could have put technology in place and could have taken care of their uh, children's education by way of distance mode. And the final thing which happened was the banking sector, which is growing up like anything in Africa, came to a grinding halt. I mean, the banks were in a bad trouble. There was not enough up, up, offtake of credit. People could not go to the bank and get money. And therefore, they also had plenty of problem for SMEs, for which Africa is not particular. So I think these are the kind of areas, and then agriculture. So people could not even go to field and cultivate, and so it was an all-round problem which Africa had during COVID. I think these are the kind of areas where India and Africa need to come together, talk it out, see where India can support them, which is going to be a win-win both for Africa and also for India.
To what extent can India's South South cooperation model effectively adapt to the diverse needs and aspirations of various African nations in the contemporary times?
Well, South-South is a very powerful tool.
Yes.
And if you really recall what happened when India was the presidency for G20, I mean, it was India's influence and India's, support to Africa Union. And I recall when G20 happened, the G20 brought African continent on a place where from they could see the hope for tomorrow. So we had the head of African Union. He came in, and then we finally decided to take Africa in as a permanent member of G20. I think G20 is a kind of consortium which is pretty high on trade, commerce, technology, agriculture, animal husbandry. I mean, you name it, G20 can come together and try and provide a very futuristic pathway for Africa. So I think India's whole idea of bringing African continent as a permanent member of G20 was a very powerful tool to keep on pushing South-South goal and
Yes.
South-South cooperation between India and Africa, not only between India and Africa, but among all G20 members and Africa. So you can really figure out when tomorrow things begin to shape up. You can't imagine how much more African people, African continent, African trade, commerce, and which will also mean issues like climate change, sustainable development, uh, putting to an end the large scale inequity can play out in a very powerful way, which can provide a futuristic pathway for Africa to keep on moving despite the challenges they have had.
In your opinion, what strategies can India and African nations employ to ensure their bilateral trade and investment ties are more equitable and mutually beneficial amidst the evolving global economic landscapes?
I think it's very important that Africa and India needs to sit together and look at the following.
Mm.
The first one is how longer is Africa going to take to integrate all of its 54 countries in the continent? Because unless you have the scale, you can't really do much. I think once the integration within Africa happens, then India and Africa could probably go and do a trade agreement. And as I said, trade agreement between Africa and India might be a more powerful tool to transfer a lot of technical expertise from the side of India up until African people and African continent. One example, their airlines are in Africa. I mean, if you were to fly anywhere in Africa, you need to go to Addis. And then I have just one choice of airline, which is Ethiopian Airlines.
Yes.
And look, you are being given the choice of airline much against your wishes, simply because you don't have any other airline. So I think once that Africa is interconnected,
Mm.
you will have many pathways for many different players to get in and try and make Africa more diverse, which will also result in more trade, more commerce, more less time taken. And then Africa is very close to Europe.
Mm.
I mean, look, you can fly from others to any part of Europe in about a couple of hours. I think it will then mean that not only India and Africa, but India, Europe, and Africa could probably come and try and do the things in a way that it could be very, very powerful. For instance, India has done a trade agreement with Britain. And if Africa were to integrate fast enough, then it could really offer a trickle-down effect to African continent. So one thing is that Africa will need to come together and become one Africa. Second part, Africa generally deals with many currencies, which is not a very good idea, especially when you go out and do your trade with a third country. So I think there currency has to come together. Maybe one currency, they can call it by any name, and then they can go on. They also need to identify the trade and commerce hub. Well, I mean, for flying, you go to Addis, but I can foresee that as Africa keeps on evolving, Nairobi will become their commercial hub. And Nairobi, once it becomes a commercial hub, it will connect many more continents together. So I think that is another thing. The next thing which I feel where India and Africa can come together is by the way of education. India offers umpteen opportunity to African people. There are scholarships. Government of India is very keen to get in as many more African people as possible, train them, equip them, and then they can go back and try and pursue their own developmental agenda. And then, which will also mean people to people contact, which is so important. I mean, it's not only you bring African people for education. Once they come to India, they know about Indian culture, value, and they begin to relate their own thing in Africa back to what they say and do here in India. So I think that's the second part, which also results in people to people contact. So I think as we go along, we will have to figure out which are the kind of areas where we can support and help African continent. But I think two things are very important. One, education, people to people contact, trade and commerce. There, you know, more uh, foreign currency being offered to Africa, not only from India, but also, and India and Africa could also try and figure out as they go along, how can local currencies be deployed to undertake large scale trade and commerce so that the borders don't become the barrier and we can do more of import, more of export. And we currently in India are having trade deficit with Africa. So we take less, but we give more to them. So I think we will have to find a balancing pathway in which Africa can be supported both by trade, commerce, currency swaps, more trade happening, and then whatever he is doing with Europe and UK, Africa can also come and begin to benefit from it. And therefore, it's not only South-South cooperation, but trilateral, which means two countries of similar values can come together, put the money, competence, skill, and go to African nations and try and make things happen there.
Mm. Well, so how can India and Africa collaborate more effectively on multilateral platforms to advocate for the interests of the global South, say in the most changing world order today?
See, world order is now, it's not, is multilateral, meaning multipolar.
Multipolar West versus East also.
Really. So, if you really look at Asia, you will figure out that there is a competition between country A and B and C. But Europe and America, they both have come out with their strategy documents where they say Asia is not unipolar. There are a couple of players in Africa, I mean in Asia, for instance, China, India, Japan, South Korea. So this concept of multi polar pathway is very, very much apparent. The same is in context of Europe. European Union is, a consortium of countries which are together. by virtue of the trade, commerce, and culture. So even there, things not unipolar; they are all multipolar. When we come and look at how Africa looks like, Africa will eventually become multipolar as well. I mean, look at Lagos in Africa. Their per capita GDP is much higher compared to many countries in Europe.
Yes.
You come and look at countries, small ones, they don't have anything. I mean, Cameroon, for instance, in West, 26, 27 million people,
Mm.
and the per capita GDP is pretty. So there is an overall inequity in Africa which will need to go away. And if you really look at multilateral arrangement,
Mm.
there are institutions like UN, where India has played a pretty good role. India and UN have set up a fund called UN India Fund, which is not a very large money, but about $200 million, which is being deployed to offer support and guidance to African countries. Of late, World Bank came forward and said, look, World Bank would like to create an idea where they would like to strengthen some of the African think tanks. And they said, look, I mean, the pathway would be the following. World Bank puts the money, about $50 million. They will come and route that money to Africa Development Fund. And then they will sort out or find out 5 think tanks in Africa, continental Africa, and try and figure out as to how can these think tanks come together and work on areas related to Africa integration, climate change, agriculture, education. So there are other pathways where World Bank through African Development Fund is coming forward to put on a table a large sum of money, which is about $50 million. And this is where India's role in trying to straitjacket Africa and advocating on behalf of Africa in what forums, multilateral forums like World Bank, Africa Development Fund, becomes even more of consequence. So I think multilateralism is a pathway, but for that pathway to sink in, succeed, and make the intended outcome will mean also that Africa needs to put its house in order. Because when you go and look at multilateral forums, the only thing they say, look, we are fine, but then look at your rule of law, look at your media, look at people's participation in elections or elections happening in time. So they also then try and set some kind of a conditionality because multilateral money never comes just for the heck of it. So I think Africa will also need to find its place under the sun and try and fix its problems, which are so glaring,
Yeah.
uh, in order in order to be able to get more money, more support, not only from India but also from multilateral institutions like G20, World Bank, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a pathway, and given how we are moving, on global order, Africa's influence and power in setting the global order as we move along will also be much more defined in times to come. So Africa has a role to play, but there are some difficulties in the continent which it will need to take care of before it becomes fully integrated in the multilateral systems, including with WTO.
Well, so beyond traditional economic aid, what are the innovative approaches uh, that India and African nations can adapt to foster sustainable capacity building and also knowledge transfer?
Well, this aid part is something which has made Africa pretty dysfunctional. So people came, they gave money. It was largely in terms of grant, and they then took the money and did whatever they wanted to do, and then nothing happened. So this aid part is good, but only till a time a country or continent has been able to stand on a feet. Once you have stood on a feet, then you need to figure out how can you reach out to countries at all. In case India and Africa, I'll be talking about. So while aid is fine to begin with, but it continues to feed somebody with the aid all the time, you are not doing justice to that place or content or to the people. Right? So I think we have to now move beyond traditional aid, and then we have to come back and figure out how can India and Africa uh, put more time and resource and thinking about educating African people in some of the finest uh, IITs and IIMs and universities. Second one is building the skills so that with the skills which they had built while they are here in India, they can go back and try and apply that in terms of progressing the continent, the people. And then we also have to see that government of India, which it already has been doing, technical training and hand-holding. Like for instance, in Africa, India has been training a very large contingent of their officials in many areas, and this is being done through MEA through their program called IT. So they have been training African bureaucrats. They are training people who come from Africa, including their private sector people. So I think hand-holding, capacity building, training, those are kind of areas where we can only going on and try and build the capacities of African people who in turn can take those capacities back to the country wherever they are and try to begin those things in order to the effect that they begin to see growth and development. When many African people come to India, they're very much fascinated by what India has done in context of green revolution, which is agriculture. And Africa is endowed with land. They are endowed with women who are very empowered people. They are also empowered with very hardworking youth.
Hmm.
The youth population is pretty high. And if we can try and find ways and pathways in which we can train them, build the capacity, take them back to India, show them what is happening up here, and then try and have people to people collaboration with not only governments but also NGOs, think tanks, um, um, trilateral cooperation. And if we put all of these things in order, we can very vividly see that there is a lot which India has to offer to Africa by way of training, educating, building the capacity, and showing them what we are doing here in areas of agriculture, what we are doing in terms of education, what we are doing in terms of how we are trying to handle our problems in the area of climate change, how are we trying to get more money from various sources, which are not only bilateral but multilateral, but also at the same time they are also coming from trilateral sources. I think that is the future pathway for India and Africa to come together and try and advance agenda, which is 2063 agenda. Yes. In context of Africa. And then they are also very close to our own agenda, which we call as 2070 agenda, by which time India has promised to the COP and UNFCCC that by 2070, India will become net zero and begin to move on a pathway whereby it can become a clean and green energy so that you then don't begin to attract terrorists and things of that kind. So that's the pathway, and India and Africa have a long way to go, and then they can learn from each other in order to advance what they've been doing on the ground with respect to ensuring the well being of people in Africa in ways that they will all rise to the occasion and try and do what they best need to do.
Okay. So, what role does cultural exchanges and people to people ties play in strengthening the long term resilience of India and Africa cooperation, particularly in an increasingly interconnected yet polarized world?
Well, I mean, this is what we can see very well in Africa that world is not only interconnected, but it's getting highly polarized. If you come to Africa, you will see two things. One, you will see the kind of influence for rivalry between China and Europe. I mean, that is a thing which is very visible. So China is putting a lot of money. They're building infra in Africa. And then Russia and Africa, by virtue of being long-term allies, Russians can come and protect what Chinese build. So there is a very vivid display of influence for power and pelf and money in Africa, like Cameroon, I mean the small country in West Africa. Chinese went and built their parliament. They are building roads. So I can tell you, you go to Africa and figure out how Europe and China and Russia are pitted against each other. Only with virtue of what they're doing. They're putting money, building infra, and that thing is pretty obvious to be seen by anybody. So, what is, as I said, uh, Africa is closest to Europe. And then there's a history in Africa of European influence. I mean, Germans, French. They all went to Africa and tried to colonize some countries in Africa. And it was not only colonizing Africa, but also trying to, much against wishes of Africa, they tried to either bifurcate Africa or they tried to enter into a deal whereby they will keep on doing what they want to do in Africa. And that influence is still very alive. You can go and see it. So while we are interconnected, we are closer home, but then we are also at a time when we are, you know, gobbled up by multiple difficulties. It's not easy to go anytime soon. Now, if that is the case, then while other things are fine, trade, education, training, capacity building, all those things are pretty fine. But I think as we go beyond these things, the true things which are very, very important. One is the cultural exchange and people to people contact. I can tell you, when I meet with people from Africa, even when I'm traveling to Europe, my first thing is I begin to like people. Not because they're African, but by the very virtue of who they are. And when I go to Europe, meet with people there, it's pretty hard to be able to relate. So Africa is a thing where I think two things in particular will stand out. One is the cultural exchange and ties and people to people contact. They both are interdependent, but then they play the role in a very, very um, positive pathway whereby you begin to know and learn about each other and try and identify the problems with yours. And then the larger canvas of cooperation, support, education, training, enrolling trade and commerce, then they begin to move in tandem with the time, giving you a very, very intrinsic pathway of being seen as one together. So I think these things are very, very important. And India and Africa have been doing it for a long time. But I think the time has come when we need to go beyond the obvious and try and do it in a real time.
So, how are emerging security challenges, in your opinion, such as in areas such as maritime security and cyber threats, shaping the agenda for India and Africa bilateral engagement?
Well, I mean, this is something which is pretty obvious for India. India has been tackling both the issues upfront, whole scale for a very, very long time. So, maritime and cybersecurity both are the areas and issues which, when Africa became the permanent member of G20, was put on the agenda. That how can India and Africa, on the one hand, and G20 countries in Africa on the other, could probably come and talk and find solutions to emerging security challenges. Two things were very clear. One, how can Africa learn from experiences of India and also from the experiences of G20 countries? And there are enough examples. Secondly, when it came to emerging technology and cybersecurity, India also proposed to Africa that while certain things are going to take longer time, but Africa's role in learning, educating, and finding their own pathway in terms of what they will like to do as they move ahead. For instance, cybersecurity. I mean, as I have been saying for a while, Africa's problem is not now. Cybersecurity, if cyber hackers go and hack into uh, power utilities in Africa, they will not get into anything. I mean, there is nothing to gain much. If they go and hack into banking system of Africa, they will not get much. If they go and try and hack the government agencies, they will not get anything. Their problems will begin to grow once they become one Africa. Because once the trade is consolidated, there's more money in the bank, there's more power utilities being shared with the people there. Then only hackers will have some additional allurement to put the hacking and stall African operations. So India and Africa decided after Africa became the permanent member of G20, how can India train and equip and support African policy makers not only on maritime security, but also on how cyber threats are going to escalate at a level where Africa will need to find its own solutions. And in cybersecurity, it's not enough that you know some algorithm, but you need to also try and conjoin your local context to how you are going to find your solutions. So Africa and India are ongoing, supporting each other and trying to find out as to how Africa, an African continent, could learn a trick of the trade from the experiences both of India and also of the experience of G20 countries, for instance, Brazil. I mean, look, I mean, in Africa, there are pockets of excellence and then the pockets of difficulties. So, G20 on the one hand and India on the other hand have been supporting Africa and African Union, which is the permanent member on behalf of African continent for G20, supporting them in training, capacity building, official to official exchanges, and also sharing emerging technologies. For instance, India has been supporting a couple of countries in Africa with regard to UPI, and they're doing pretty well. I mean, of course, they have mobile banking, but then they find our UPI being of more relevance with regard to how can money be transferred from one pocket to another pocket without being hijacked or without being cyber attacked.
Yes.
So India is supporting Africa. So it's not only one pathway, India and Africa, but now it is G20 and Africa and India and Africa together. So India is trying to make the best use of what it has in terms of technology, in terms of what it has been doing, but also in terms of its overall experience that it keeps encountering in its day-to-day operations across the board. So I think that's something which is pretty viable, and Africa and India are cooperating quite deeply as we talk about it, which is only going to escalate and strengthen in times to come.
So, considering the increasing focus on climate change, what concrete steps can India and African countries take together to promote climate resilience and also sustainable development initiatives?
Sure, I mean, India's story is very clear that India is basically, by and large, not to give any sweeping statement, but India, by and large, is an agrarian society where more than 70% of our people still depend on agriculture. Second thing, if that be the case, then that much more people are still living away from the cities. They are in small towns, they are in villages, they have their own local pathways. Money is a problem, banks are not so efficient, and therefore there's a second part which is very important. Third part, in context of India, is that our rural youth is in abundance. And they are basically the people who are in the age group of 18 to 35. And then while I say this, I also mean that they also involve fairly large chunk of women, girls and women in Indian villages. And finally, when climate change is affecting us, it is affecting us in a variety of ways. One, that we are, for instance, the problem of water. Go to any part of India now, you figure out that the water table is going down and going down mercilessly. And if that remains the situation for some more time, we might see many towns in India, especially the rural ones which are supporting with our Swata people, going without water. And it's not only water, it is about heat as well. I mean, heat is so much that when farmers go and grow, say, paddy, or they go and grow um, um, wheat, two things has happened. One, the per acre yield of paddy and wheat is going down. And secondly, the nutrient part, both in paddy and wheat, is also coming down. And this is where India has taken a conscious call to revert back to millet. Millet is the only cereal which does not need enough water and can carry on its strengthening its nutrient element inside it. So it is something which is very important. And now we go back and transpose what we had in India to Africa. The same thing. Africans are basically agrarian society. They have a very large swath of land, but only 10% of which is being cultivated. They have a very large number of people concentrated in rural areas where they have less money, a less support system, and when the governments don't go to figure out what Africans in the rural hinterland are doing, they also have a very large number of people, youth, which are up there not doing much because the overall what you call the portion of the productive land is not even being cultivated, and therefore that is another very similar pathway which Africa has. And Africans have one more challenge. I mean, Africa has never consumed too much, and therefore they have not produced too much either. And therefore, the whole problem of climate change in Africa is for no reason which can be contributed to the problem which Africans might have created. And therefore, if you look at Brazil, for instance, coffee, let's look at Africa, Ghana,
Yeah.
Cameroon, cocoa. I mean, I can tell you, not only the yield is going down, but it is also having an adverse effect on the livelihood of people. I can tell you, when earlier I went to Africa, I could go and buy cocoa and bring it home. And then at home, we will make things. Now, when I go to buy cocoa in Africa, it's more expensive. And secondly, I have to really make extra effort to figure out where can I get a good cocoa which I can buy and take back home. So I can tell you these things are impacting livelihood of farmers, and they're also impacting the migration because when people can't grow what they have been growing for a long time traditionally, then what happens is they leave the place, they move. So large scale climate migration is happening in Africa.
Is it also because of the middlemen?
There is, but middlemen can't really come and sway the things away from people. They come in simply because things are not good on the ground. So middlemen flourish and advance and thrive only when the things on the ground are not doing well. I mean, you can see it anywhere. When people are poor, when people are uneducated, when people are not being able to do what they want to do, then you have middlemen, you have. But the fact of the matter is that Africa, for no fault of its own, has been suffering with the consequences of climate change. And then global south people come and say to Africans, you try and reduce your CO2. When they have not done it in the first place, why should Africans be ever told to cut down on their CO2? So climate negotiations are there to blame, and Africans are not saying, look, we want repair damage, we want more money. We have not done the crisis which we can see today. And Africa has so much heat, so much rain, and everything happens in about 2 hours, equivalent to 24-hour frame. So Africa is a very similar, not identical, but a very similar place when we put India and Africa together. And therefore, there's a lot for India and Africa to learn from each other and support each other by the way of hand-holding, support, training, education, and supporting them at multilateral institutions too. Because when co-ops happen, you can see even China and India will come together and dictate. So I think once we put Africa, China, and India into negotiating climate change issues at COP and UNFCCC, I think we can see a better future for humanities in Africa tomorrow.
So we come to the end of the podcast. And before we wind up, what message would you like to give for cyber peace?
Well, CyberPeace is doing an excellent work, and these podcasts are the way out because you're weaving the story, you are telling the truth, and you're putting the lens squarely on the problems, challenges, difficulties, but then you are also trying to advance solutions which are equally very, very important. So, my best wishes to cyber peace. And I would only say keep on highlighting challenges, but also try to advance agenda through solutions which could be a win-win for people, both in India and outside India as well.
Thank you so much, sir. On behalf of CyberPeace, it was an honor hosting you. And thank you for tuning into our show. This is Dr. Preeti signing off.